Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's not an exaggeration today to say that we have two of the country's most important legal minds with us. So let me start with an admission of guilt. I invited myself into today's event. That is, I wasn't scheduled to do the welcome, but I took the director's prerogative to do so. And I did so because we're really fortunate to have two guests and a moderator who speak to the issues most important, not just to the country, but to the Miller Center, and who do so in a way that involves not just academic excellence and integrity, but real world understanding and applied to real world challenges. In fact, that's the mission of the Miller Center. And all three of them also have UVA pedigrees. At least two of our guests share with me an affiliation with the Brookings Institution, and we'll find out from Bob if he's got one that I don't know about. Which was my home away from home here in Charlottesville for 10 years. Bauer and Jack Goldsmith are two of America's leading political and legal minds, and they've served under presidents from both parties. Bob served in the Obama White House as legal counsel to the president. Jack worked in the George W. Bush Department of Justice and Department of Defense, which gives important weight and a balanced perspective to their new book, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. For scholars, policymakers, and informed citizens, this is simply a must-read. As I mentioned, both Jack and Bob have important ties to UVA's School of Law. Bob is a graduate and Jack taught at the law school from 1994 to 1997. In addition to Bob Bauer's work in the White House, he's a professor at NYU School of Law. He was named co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2013. More recently, he served as a senior advisor to now President Biden's presidential campaign, including in leading the effort to secure the full and fair counting of votes and to combat efforts to discredit the election results. We're really honored to have you with us today, Bob, and for your service. Jack Goldsmith also now works as a scholar and professor at Harvard's Law School and at the Hoover Institution. And the Brookings affiliation is the co-founder of Lawfare, a prominent blog based at Brookings devoted to the analysis of law and national security issues. In my opinion, Lawfare is one of the most important think tank undertakings of the last 2 decades. Jack clerked for Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, and locally for Court of Appeals Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson here in Charlottesville. So a virtual welcome back to Charlottesville, Jack. Our moderator today is Katie Dunn-Tempest, a senior fellow here at the Miller Center and also with governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where she runs the White House Transition Project. She too has her PhD from UVA. Katie's a scholar of the American presidency with a focus on White House staffing, presidential transitions, and the intersection of politics and policy within the presidency. This event was all Katie's doing, and I'm really appreciative that she let me bust in. There's no one better equipped to lead us through today's conversation, and we're really grateful to have you with us. Before we start, a special thanks to our events and webinar team, and to you, our audience at the Miller Center. We've been at this now for a year. We've hosted over 50 webinars, reaching over 50,000 viewers, and I'm so appreciative for everything that our team has done and for our audience sticking with us all along the way. So with all of that said, thank you all again. And Katie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Miller Center audience for being here. I too was delighted when Jack and Bob responded that they would be happy to participate in an event like this. I knew the minute this book was published, I think it was last fall, October or so, that it was going to be a tour de force about sort of what's going wrong with the presidency, what needs to be fixed, and how can we do it in a calculated, informed manner. So I'm delighted that you agreed to do this. And I just want to thank the audience for coming one more time and also remind you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom. I would love to incorporate your questions over the course of this hour discussion. So that's just another reminder for that. And for Jack and Bob, I'd just like to start out first with an origins type of question. And I understand that you met in January of 2019 because the two of you were going to co-author a book about the White House Counsel's Office. And every conversation about how to author this book, you sort of diverted to something that occurred in the Trump administration. And eventually it was sort of the birth of this particular book, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. And I was really curious to know kind of what particular event or norm-breaking moment in the Trump administration sort of pushed the needle over from writing a book about the White House counsel's office to writing this 400-page book that has roughly 50 different reform initiatives in it? At what point did you think that that was the more important book to write and decide to go forward? So why don't we start with Jack first and then Bob second?
Sure. Thank you, Katie. And it's a real pleasure to be here. This might be my first Miller Center event. I'm very grateful to be here. I was thinking before I came here how often I rely on Miller Center publications. And I actually went through each of my last 4 books, and each of the last 4 books I've written had relied heavily on Miller Center publications, ranging from Separation of Powers Commission report in the late 90s to your oral history interviews with attorneys general and generals and White House counsels. And even for a book I wrote on Jimmy Hoffa, your extraordinarily well-organized collection of the Nixon tapes. Anyway, it's one of the first places I go when I do research about the presidency and other things, and I'm super grateful to be here. So as Katie suggested, Bob and I were going to write a book about the White House Counsel, which is an office where Bob used to work, and that an office I used to work with a lot from the Justice Department when I was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel. There's no great book on the history and importance of the White House Counsel's office and how it's changed. And that book ended up being something of a chapter in this book, but over the course of that day, I can't actually remember, maybe Bob does, what the particular norm-breaking actions were that day. But over the course of the day, we just kept talking about the 1970s reforms of the presidency and how well they had worked both on the law side and the norm side until the Trump administration. Not perfectly, but pretty well. And just how much those weren't working today. And by the end of the day, we had reached the conclusion that Trump had exposed all sorts of accountability holes and legal constraint holes and gaps in the presidency. And B, we believed, and we still hope it's going to be true, that after Trump leaves office, there was going to be a discussion about how the presidency should be reformed, akin to the 1970s. So that was the basic thinking. We agreed that day that we were going to write this book. We didn't really know what the topics were. We may have sketched out a few. We didn't know how much consensus we were going to be able to generate. Bob and I both worked in different presidential administrations, and we have different views about some things. And 440 pages later, we were able to agree on quite a lot. Not every single thing, but quite a lot. And maybe Bob wants to add something to that.
No, that's how I remember it as well. And that we, in the course of the day, we decided that we're going to take on some of these significant executive branch issues as exposed by Donald Trump, but certainly building on issues in past presidencies. We might as well take on the whole thing. And I don't know, Jack, if you remember this as I do, I could be wrong about this, but it started with a conversation about the White House counsel's office. And then we ended up writing a book that only later did we decide would also cover the White House counsel's office. So it actually it started with that, disappeared for a while, and then reemerged as a chapter in the book.
That's right.
That's fascinating. Very interesting. And while our hour doesn't give us enough time to review the 50 reforms, I was also wondering if in each of your minds, there's sort of a hierarchy of needs. And some of these reforms to you are far more important than others. And so if you could each sort of take a turn to say, if you could have kind of the top 3 reforms be enacted by Congress or through the Justice Department or something like that, which reforms would you prioritize?
Bob, you want to go first?
No, I'm happy to go first. When you say most important, I tend to also merge the significance of the issue in my mind with achievability, which is what is likely to come up right now that we think you could develop some sort of bipartisan consensus on. And so I begin with financial conflicts of interest. The lowest of the low-hanging fruits, it seems to me, is mandatory presidential production of tax returns, but you could add to that, and we have an extensive chapter on it, what we think is much more thoroughgoing, in addition to the disclosure of tax returns, thoroughgoing financial conflict of interest regulation of the president, so that presidents cannot be involved in running business activities concurrently with their term of office. And that includes the transparency requirements that we would recommend. So that would certainly be one of the top on the list. Also on the list would be the reforms that are needed to, I think, restore the reputation of the Department of Justice, which I think has been badly damaged. This was a focus of reform after Watergate. I think it ought to be a focus of the reform now. And we have a mix of proposals, both statutory and internal regulatory in nature for doing that. And then third is a little bit of a jump ball. To me, we certainly should be looking at more regulation to prevent foreign interference in our elections. But I would also like to think that there's the potential for some agreement on what we do in the way of vacancies reform. There's some significant problems that have developed in the process by which these government positions are filled and vacancies are filled, and we have a chapter devoted to that, and that's really important. And there's the basis for a deal there, we think, between Congress and the executive that could contribute to a better functioning executive branch, and an executive branch that performs more responsibly and accountably.
Great.
So I agree with all
What
that.
about-
Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
I was going to say, go ahead, and maybe you could sort of, I understand that there is the question of what's feasible or what's possible, but maybe two different. One is like a wish list of what you think you can get through or what you would like to see implemented. And then what's the sort of more realistic approach about kind of the Bob's approach here?
Right. So we'd like to see it all implemented, but that's not realistic. And we knew that in writing the book. Some of the issues, war powers, for example, are perennial, very difficult separation of powers questions that we have reform proposals for. And I actually think there's more of a taste for now than there has been at any time since the 70s, but that is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be soon. So I kind of agree with what Bob said. I mean, at the top of the list of both important and relatively easy are the financial conflict of interest issues, tax disclosure, conflict of interest, and the like. Those are issues on which there have been bipartisan consensus across the branches and across the parties in the presidency and in Congress since the 70s. And now that Trump has gone from the scene, I think there's a possibility that we could see movement on those to change what were norms into law, to make sure that the next President Trump, the next populist demagogic president, is more constrained in those areas. Just one other important preliminary point. I mean, now is the time when these reforms need to be done. We see there seems to be a sense that, we've gone back to a somewhat normal presidency who's basically complying with the norms and constraints that prevailed across the party since the 70s. And so for some people, these issues have become less important, but they're more important than ever because now is the time to act. You can't make these amendments and make these changes when they're pressed into service, so to speak, when you need them. So now is the time to do it. So again, on the most feasible, I would say all of the ones that can be implemented unilaterally in the Justice Department concerning a variety of, we have a whole list of proposals to buck up the norms of independence of the Justice Department. Part of that is personnel, but part of that also is translating into clear regulations, some normative constraints that we think can have bite even for a less norm compliant presidency. The only thing I'll add to what Bob said that I think is vitally important, and it goes to this Justice Department president relationship and the Justice Department independence and constraining the president. And this grew out of the Mueller report. It's been perennially unclear for decades now the extent to which the president of the United States is subject to obstruction of justice and the obstruction of justice statute. So many things Trump did seemed like obstruction of justice, but it's just not clear, as even Bob Mueller struggled with this in his report. It's not clear about the extent to which obstruction of justice, the statute, applies to the president. We have some very concrete proposals about that, and also as it relates to bribery. I think that's a very high agenda item. That needs to be clarified for the American people and for presidents going forward. It shouldn't be as unclear as it is now. So that's a long answer, but that's basically what I think.
No, it's very helpful. One of our audience members, Beth, is really interested in other historical moments in American history where it was kind of an opportune right moment for reform. So you mentioned the 1970s reforms. Can you identify any other periods in American history where it seemed like it was ready for reform and we did so?
Of the presidency?
Yeah.
Not on the scale of the 70s. I can't think of anything on the scale of the 70s. There have been, piecemeal reforms of the presidency going back to to the beginning. But the 70s was a particular point where, growing out of Watergate, growing out of Vietnam, growing out of the Church Commission, and all the revelations about the intelligence community activities. And then also we happened to be in a moment where the country was kind of behind reform and the Congress was a particularly reforming Congress, the conditions really were ripe then in a way that frankly they aren't now. I mean, we have opportunities now because President Biden is open to many of these things. He's probably the president I worked for, President Bush, would have been less open to some of these reforms. And a lot of our reforms, again, have been topics of bipartisan consensus. But that said, I wonder what Bob thinks about this. I think now it's much more difficult. It's just harder to get these things through now than it was in the 1970s for a whole host of reasons. And I can't think of any other analogies.
Bob, what about you?
I've been sort of rifling through the history in my head, and I can't think of anything that does approach the 1970s as a sort of a period of time of sustained focus on executive branch reform and constraining executive power. And I also agree, however, that the conditions then for accomplishing it were dramatically different than the ones that obtained today. And so I think it's going to be much harder right now. Again, that's where achievability becomes such an important consideration. It's hard to imagine if you take the I'm either for or against Donald Trump argument out of it, that most Americans, however you decide to poll opinion on this point, are going to think that it's a bad idea for presidents to produce their tax returns, or they're going to dispute the proposition that presidents shouldn't be trying to profit from office or run businesses concurrently with a full-time presidency. And so I do think there's some consensus available there. But in so many other respects, it's going to be very difficult to achieve the kind of reasonably extensive bipartisanship behind the reforms of the 1970s. I was thinking, for example, of the 1970s campaign finance reform enactments, and Republicans voted for it in large numbers in both the House and the Senate, and President Ford signed the legislation. Would that happen today? I mean, if you put this in a more modern Republican presidential context, I don't think so. Yeah.
And the only other time sort of looking back that occurred to me was with Chester Arthur and the Pendleton Act, sort of changing the civil service reform. That's another moment, but I still sort of agree with both of you that sharp contrast to 1970s, and that's a long way to go back. One of our listeners, Carlo, is interested, and maybe I could direct this to you, Bob, about financial disclosure in the tax returns and things of that nature and conflicts of interest. Would you extend that also to members of the House and Senate?
So that's a very good question. Members of the House and Senate do currently comply with financial disclosure requirements that are imposed on under the Ethics in Government Act. So do presidents and presidential candidates. And Donald Trump famously said that he thought he'd adequately discharged his accounting for his finances by filing these Ethics in Government Act personal financial disclosure forms that members of Congress, and by the way, candidates for Congress and president also file. They are not as detailed in the information provided. The income reporting and the asset reporting are within very broad ranges. So pinning down precisely what somebody's financial circumstances are is very difficult to do. And as I said, it does not contain a lot of the detail that tax returns do. If Congress passes a statute and the president signs it that mandates tax return disclosure, then it may be that members of Congress are facing the question, well, why then shouldn't you also disclose your tax returns? But I think there are arguments that distinguish the reason why this more invasive disclosure requirement applies to the executive, who, among other things, by the way, oversees the administration of the IRS, than would be true in the case of members of Congress. So hopefully that argument doesn't spook members of Congress into not doing what I think in the case of presidents they should do.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Jack?
No, not really. I mean, our book is, we kind of, there are a whole bunch of questions about what other reforms in the government would be useful. There's a lot of things wrong with the government right now, both useful on their own terms and to improve the presidency. We focus like a laser beam on just the presidency. We kind of accepted Congress the way it is, the courts the way it is, the courts the way they are, the law the way it is, and just focused on the presidency. But there are certainly, I mean, I agree with Bob, there's an argument for extending it, but I wouldn't want to insist on extending it if it chilled Congress from what we think is the more important reform of applying this to the president.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I know that your book came out, you wrote it in a speedy 18 months, which is incredibly impressive. And so it was published in the fall before the ascertainment delay from GSA and before the insurrection of January 6th. And so if your publisher, Lawfare, was asking you to write an epilogue or add some additional things, what might you add? Bob, would you start first?
Well, you hit on one that and Jack and I have had conversations about this, and we've actually started sort of developing and sketching out some notions for reform. There is no question that we saw the arrangements for a lawful transition between presidencies tested like never before. And there are any number of things that need to happen here to not have this happen again. This could have gotten even worse than it was, to say the least. And even the administrator of the GSA, upon issuing at long last the ascertainment that the Biden-Harris ticket was the likely winner of the election, the apparent winner of the election, and therefore the next phase of the transition could begin, appealed for this burden to be taken off of future GSA administrators. She said, I shouldn't have to make these decisions, and she's 100% right. And so that is a requirement, it seems to us, given what a tight time period obtains anyway between an election and an inauguration, to significantly reform the transition process. So I would certainly put that on the list, yes.
Mm-hmm. And anything with January 6th and the insurrection, anything?
It's
so
very, I'm sorry, Jack, please.
No, please, you go, because I don't have a good answer to that.
Well, no, the only thing I was going to say was, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, there's no good answer, that is for sure. There's a lot of talk about amendments to the Electoral Count Act to clarify roles. You heard at the time, an awful lot of, supposed confusion. I didn't think it was all that confusing about what the role of the vice president was in the actual final tally by the Congress of the electoral votes. The Electoral Count Act is old, and it's one of the most, Byzantine statutes that's written almost impenetrably. And so that could use reform. That will be hard, but that ought to be on the agenda reform list, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add that there's a limit to reform. And we have, as you say, over 4 dozen reforms, over 14 chapters on, 20 different topics. But there's a lot that can't be fixed through law and norm changes. A lot is dependent upon who the occupant of the Oval Office is. And a lot of the destructive stuff that President Trump did during the transition is very hard to constrain by law, because a lot of it is just the president talking. And so, we wrote a book about reform. We believe in reform. We think that these reforms are very consequential, but there are some things that can't be fixed by law, that can only be fixed by elections and electing the right person.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Our listener, James, has a question more to do with sort of the procedure if reforms ever hit the Senate floor. And he's concerned about the rise in filibusters. And so I know we've talked a little bit about the differences between the 1970s and the environment which reforms were passed and the current environment. Can you talk about that in relation to the filibuster? Bob, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just pointing to Jack.
Are you asking about reforming the filibuster, or how the filibuster is going to affect reforms?
He seems to think it will affect reform and make it more difficult.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that the filibuster applies to the kind of reforms we do, and I think it would, Bob can correct me, he's more of an expert on that than I am, but it basically means you're going to need a supermajority in the Senate. So that raises the question whether you're going to be able to find enough Republicans in the Senate to be able to join these reforms. Now, we think, again, prioritization in the Senate and politics in the Congress and what the White House's agenda is, all of these are things that can't be controlled. And this issue is not at the top of the priority list for anyone, although pockets of it are in bills around the Congress. We think that it's an ideal time to peel off 10 or 12, if not more, Republicans, because after all, we're talking about constraining the president in some important ways when there's a Democrat president in office who would support these reforms. So it's not going to be a Republican president whose ox is being gored in the first instance. These might be seen by many as anti-Trump reforms, but they needn't be seen that way. And now that Trump is gone from the scene, we're hoping also that there's a chance that some Republicans who, before the Trump administration, supported the norms that we're suggesting be changed into law. So that may sound hopeful, but if there's a time when these reforms can be achieved, I think for a lot of these reforms, now is the time, precisely because of who's in the Oval Office. And if you have a president supporting these reforms, and you need Republicans in Congress and the president's a Democrat, that's a good time to try.
Yeah. And Bob, related to reform, can you talk a little bit about the bill HR 1? And I think it's a bill that the House has introduced that seeks to root out corruption and also voter reform. Can you talk a little bit about that bill?
Certainly. I mean, I can sort of sketch out, I'm sure the audience is familiar with much of it. It's a very comprehensive reform package. It includes voting rights reform, campaign finance reform, redistricting reform, government ethics reform. So it's a very ambitious reform proposal. It's now in the Senate. And as you know, the question there that has been presented is whether with the Republicans, as far as I can tell, in complete opposition to it. In other words, a unified Republican opposition. And these are issues also, I should add, that the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, gets very exercised about. He's been following these, campaign finance and other sort of political regulatory issues for a long time, and he tends to turn them into leadership issues. So he doesn't really allow 1,000 flowers to bloom in his caucus to the extent that he can help it. It's not clear at the moment what's going to happen. As you probably know, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who is an important voice in all of this, has indicated he does not want to weaken or eliminate the filibuster. That's his position at the moment. And that he also is going to be very reluctant to support any voting rights reform. And that has been the focus of a lot of the discussion of HR 1, just because voting rights, of course, is a keen concern right now. He's not prepared to support voting rights reform on anything other than a bipartisan basis, although he hasn't defined the extent to which that bipartisanship would have to be in evidence.
Interesting. Okay. One of our listeners, Michael, notes that you stress the importance of removing foreign intervention in U.S. elections. But he's also wondering about tech companies such as Twitter and Facebook and the interference by those companies. Do you think that's also important?
The public policy debate is obviously very much focused on the role of these dominant platforms and the question of what kind of balance would be struck, if a balance is to be struck, between self-regulation and potential renewed government regulatory involvement. And those are very unresolved issues. I'm sure everybody's followed the hearings at which Congress pressed them very hard on their policies, the efforts that those platforms have made to answer the public concerns with internal procedures that they've adopted voluntarily of one kind or the other. This is a major debate that I think is going to consume. It's going to consume, the whole debate about the information environment for a long time to come.
Interesting. Jack, do you have anything to add on that front?
No, we don't propose regulating the social media platforms who obviously for 2 elections now have been central players in efforts by foreign governments to in various ways influence the election. We focused mostly on the relationship between presidential campaigns and foreign governments, where there's been a particular weakness revealed. Frankly, that's a relatively easy issue compared to the issue of regulating social media. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear that certainly the social media companies were much more aggressive and self-conscious about foreign influence through their platforms in 2020 that compared to 2016. I think there were serious improvements there. There were errors in many directions. It's not clear. I mean, we haven't thought this through fully. This is one of these things where the cure may be worse than the disease if the government gets involved in regulating that. And of course, it spills over not just into foreign influence, but all of the enormously difficult speech issues raised by these platforms and their large control over our politics, or at least large influence over our politics. So that's all by way of saying I don't have a great solution to that. I've been thinking about it a lot, and it's not obvious what the right answer is, although it's clearly a very important issue.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think 2 unique aspects to your book have to do with both of you, in the sense that a Republican and a Democrat got together to write this book about reform, and you're both legal scholars and public servants. And I was wondering about the extent to which your time in government influenced your thoughts and views on these various reforms. Bob, do you want to give that a shot?
Certainly, I'm happy to. I'd say, even to an extent that I haven't fully absorbed myself, it absolutely affected the way I think about these issues. And by the way, that had maybe the reverse effect that some might imagine. I didn't come out of the government with a head of steam about defending everything that I saw and every judgment I made, every decision I made. Quite the contrary. I came out of the government and was very glad for the opportunity to serve a president I greatly admired, and value that opportunity above all others that I've been given in my professional life. But I also took away some, I call them lessons, thoughts, inspirations, whatever you may say, that had me, think hard and critically about how the executive branch functions and about our current conceptions of the presidency, and some of the real problems that led to the ground being prepared. And I'm not speaking specifically of the Obama administration. I'm just speaking about the history of the presidency up until the Trump administration, the ground being prepared for the extraordinary problems presented by the Trump presidency. So yes, it had a very significant effect on my thinking.
What about you, Jack?
Yes, on several dimensions. First of all, let me compliment Bob. So he kind of undersold himself there. Bob was very self-reflective. I was too, about our time in government. I've been critical in other books about things that happened in government that I was involved in. And so some of our proposals in the book were ones that maybe the best example is the proposal on the White House counsel's office, where Bob, and this was, I have to give him credit, this was Bob's idea. I came to agree with it. The idea of shrinking the White House counsel, and because of its role, maybe too powerful role in the White House and in presidential governance, and sending some of those responsibilities to the Justice Department. It's not often that you see someone coming out of government calling for shrinking of the office that they once served in. And I think it's a great chapter, and Bob deserves almost all the credit for that. That's an example of the general point I wanted to make. 2 points. One is, there's no doubt, this is a book that was written by insiders in the executive branch. It's not an insider book in the sense of, we're not telling war stories or anything like that. But I think we have a pretty good understanding of how these issues of presidential power and legal and normative constraints work. We have an especially good aggregate perspective, because Bob saw things from the White House side, I saw things from the Justice Department side. So all of the book it's meant to be accessible for a general audience, but it's definitely informed on every page by our experiences and by our understanding of how things actually work. And then on another dimension, I mean, as you mentioned at the outset, Bob and I have different political views. We had different types of positions in the government, and we self-consciously set out in this book to try to write something that was bipartisan or ecumenical, however you want to put it. And we self-consciously approached these issues in that spirit, and we argued a lot, we debated a lot, we talked through things. It was a wonderful experience about trying to reach consensus, and reaching consensus without too much trouble on almost every issue. And one of the principles that guided us was, it's a pretty good principle, I think. It doesn't always work in practice, but any presidential constraint that we thought that we were proposing, we asked, would we be willing to accept that on a president that we prefer, as opposed to one that we don't prefer? And any presidential power or discretion, would we be happy for a president other than the one we voted on to have that? And we took this self-consciously veil of ignorance perspective, or golden rule perspective, to every issue in the book. And I think it led to some fruitful proposals, I hope.
Yes, definitely. I'm glad that you mentioned the reforms with the White House counsel's office. And the basic idea, for those of you who haven't read the book, is that the White House counsel's office has become more of sort of the president's personal lawyer instead of the institutional lawyer. It seems, you can correct me if I interpret it wrong, but and so why not shrink the size of the office and move many of these lawyers over to OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department? That particular office has an institutional memory. Instead of being cleared out every 4 or 8 years, many of these career civil servants have been there for decades. But I wanted to press you on that. And actually, 2 of our listeners are also interested in the OLC. But as an outsider looking at DOJ and as a political scientist, I've never thought of OLC as not being a presidency-friendly office. So in that sense, by shifting lawyers there, it's just sort of a different location, but it still seems to me as an office that is presidency-friendly. And
Yes.
please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on that and the OLC more broadly as this interpreter of laws.
So I'll take that since I used to head the Office of Legal Counsel. It's a fair point, but I don't think we're making a relative judgment about White House Counsel's Office versus Justice Department. And while the Office of Legal Counsel in public debates is not known for pushing back hard against the president, that's not actually a fair reflection. What we tend to see from the White House Counsel, from the Office of Legal Counsel, are the times it says yes, that's what gets reported. Those are sometimes controversial. And so if you only see the yeses, you tend to think that's an office that is basically giving the president what he or she wants. You tend not to see the no's. You tend not to see the constraining legal advice because those, for a lot of complicated reasons, tend not to be written down and published. The general point, but I agree with you completely, and it's definitely true. The Office of Legal Counsel is not like a neutral court in making apolitical decision-making. That is not our claim. That's certainly not true. I've written a whole book about OLC decision-making and what it's like. The point is a relative one, and you mentioned some of the factors. Whatever you think about OLC, it is embedded in a culture of the Justice Department that is dominated by civil servants, including in the Office of Legal Counsel, where, as you said, there are many, it's dominated by non-political persons. Basically, there are only a handful, 5 or 6 political appointees in the OLC. And the culture of the Justice Department, and I definitely felt this when I was there, and especially when I was saying no to the president, the culture of the Justice Department is something that influences OLC decision-making. Our point is not that you're going to suddenly have neutral, detached decision-making for the president by narrowing the White House Counsel and giving more to OLC. Definitely not true. It's just that you're on the path to taking away some of the politics of presidential decision-making and putting it in a place that is relatively more independent. And I do believe that that's true. And I do think that one gets a misplaced conception just by reading the headlines about what OLC does.
Interesting. No, those are really good points. We don't hear at all about the negatives in the times that you've advised the president to the contrary. Do you have anything to add to that, Bob?
No, I would just stress the environment point. I do think the environments are very different. The White House is an intense location where the lawyers wind up, the lawyers who are in the White House counsels wind up, and the White House counsel himself or herself is a senior aide to the president, a member of the president's senior team. And that doesn't have to say that White House counsels routinely disregard their actual status as lawyers for the government, for the people of the United States, and slip impermissibly into the role of lawyers for the president. That's happened in the past, but that is to say lawyers for the president as an individual with personal interests. That's not their role, but it has happened in the past. But that's not the principal problem. The principal problem is that while it is important to have some legal capability in the West Wing, so that it's convenient to the president, to the senior staff, the better part of the analysis is best done outside that operation, outside that environment, in an environment that is professionalized to the extent and in the way that Jack just described.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know that it's somewhat beyond the scope of the book because you don't really address the reform of executive orders, but a lot of our listeners are really interested about sort of the extreme use and possible abuse of executive orders by president. Is that anything that you've thought about or anything that you could comment on, Jack?
Sure. I've thought about it a lot. It's not something that we in general address in our book. It's a problem. So first of all, executive order, there's nothing inherently wrong with executive orders. Executive orders are nothing but presidential orders that take some pre-existing authority, either in a statute or the Constitution, and changes it into a presidential directive of sorts. So, and they've been used to as fonts of desegregation, and in very important and non-controversial ways. And most executive orders aren't legally controversial. Sometimes executive orders, like signing statements, are considered to be per se bad, and it's just not true. But they can be abused, and they have been abused, executive orders, and they have been abused by both parties, and they've been I shouldn't even say abused. They've been used increasingly aggressively, and there are reasons for it. One is presidents are charged with getting things done, and they're elected to get things done. Congress in recent decades has not been able to basically function very well. And so we saw this especially in the Obama administration. President Obama, in his first term, I'm simplifying, said there were certain things he couldn't do without Congress, and he had changed his mind by the second term and started using old authorities in new ways, in new and imaginative ways. And President Bush before him did that, and President Trump did that also. And you increasingly see presidents who can't work with Congress relying on their own authorities based on old congressional authorities, using them in new ways. So that's one part of it. The other part is that this means usually that it gets litigated. And so what ends up happening as a result of this, as a result of basically the breakdown in Congress, is that our public policy these days is being made by presidents being ever more aggressive in using extant old authorities to deal with problems like immigration, criminal justice reform, healthcare, everything really. And then you have it litigated, and you have the Supreme Court ultimately deciding what the right policy is based on how convincing the executive was that it was acting legitimately under this authorization. So I'll just say, I'll just close by saying this is an increasing problem. It's a problem ultimately that is caused by the breakdown in Congress. One of the most consequential relationships in the next 3.5 years is going to be, I predict, it's not a startling prediction. President Biden is going to use this technique, and the more conservative than ever Supreme Court is going to not allow it a lot. That's going to be a fundamental clash because the court is having the view that more and more that presidents shouldn't be able to do this. Presidents are doing it more and more. And that clash is going to be very consequential in the next 3.5 years. That's a long answer, but I think it warrants a long answer.
Yeah. And so you just see this as an inexorable trend. Like the next president is probably going to issue more executive orders and be more aggressive about it, probably.
Depending on
what has to change.
A couple of things have to change. Well, first of all, I'm not sure then what the next president's going to do, because ultimately it's about what the court is going to allow the president to do. I mean, that's in the first instance, unless and until Congress acts. What needs to change is for Congress to be able to legislate on contemporary issues. I mean, we're seeing a little bit of that now, but we also see how hard it is. And across a whole array of issues, Congress just doesn't legislate very often anymore. So presidents are, for example, regulating the climate based on statutes that are decades and decades old. They have very general authorizations, and presidents use them, and President Obama did, and I expect President Biden will use them in very imaginative and novel ways to try to achieve policy ends. And they're going to continue to try to do that, even if the court pushes back on it, until they can get what they need from Congress. It's just, it's kind of the way modern governance works, for better or probably worse.
Mm-hmm. Bob, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it well. I agree with what you said.
Yeah. So sort of flipping the coin, instead of looking at the president and executive orders, sort of one of the listeners has a question about, and this occurred throughout the impeachment processes, a president that's unwilling to respond to congressional subpoenas. I realize, again, this is beyond the scope of your book, but what do you think about that? And are there ways to sort of enhance compliance to these congressional subpoenas? Bob?
We do address the issue briefly in the book. We support a reform, and it is a reform others have articulated, which would provide for expedited judicial review of these conflicts between the executive branch and the Congress. But as you know from the tortured history in the courts of these issues, there have been sort of fundamental questions raised, and that ultimately the Supreme Court will have to resolve questions raised about, what role courts should have in these disputes. And for a long period of time, courts have been urging the two parties, when the two parties were prepared, when I say parties, I don't mean political parties, the two branches, courts have been urging them to try to resolve these clashes through accommodation. And now accommodation, certainly in the Trump administration, was not something that at least one branch was particularly interested in. And I'm sure the Republicans will say the Democrats and the Congress weren't interested in it either. And so the courts have been put in the middle. If you accept that the courts ultimately have to resolve these kinds of questions, that they are the appropriate branch to resolve it, that it is not going to get resolved, if you will, in the political marketplace, then that is something that is going to be increasingly for the courts to do. And what you don't want to have happen is the party that is, I keep on saying party, I don't mean to confuse the political party, the branch that is trying to slow things up, and that's typically going to be the executive branch, just runs out the clock. And so we look for streamlining the process by which courts could hear these conflicts and resolve them in a timely fashion.
Can I just add something to that, though? If I could, Katie.
Oh, sure.
So we do propose this kind of streamlining the process to get the court stacked faster. But I'll just say 2 or 3 things about that. First of all, it's definitely true that the Trump administration was particularly obstreperous and difficult, but this is not something that began with the Trump administration. I mean, President Obama's administration and the Bush administration frequently resisted congressional subpoenas. There are 2 sides to this coin. The issue is legally unresolved. And so it's not clear where the line should be drawn as the first point, and that these problems are kind of have a long tail. Second one is expediting the process is not going to necessarily work to Congress's favor. I mean, it will help, which is what we propose. It will help avoid the executive running out the clock problem. But my best guess is the current Supreme Court is going to be more sympathetic to the executive branch than to Congress on a lot of these issues. And so the fast tracking may ultimately result in rules which doesn't help Congress, perhaps. And the third point is Congress, and this is again, traditionally has a whole bunch of other tools it can use to retaliate against the president. This is the way separation of powers is supposed to work, whether it's funding, whether it's appointments, whether it's hearings, whole bunch of tools that it can use if the president is not doing something that it thinks is very important. These are theoretical tools that it hasn't been able, for the most part, to come together to use. But ultimately, that is how the issue can be resolved if the Supreme Court rules in, as I fear it might, or think it might, and tips the balance to the executive branch on some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be kind of a recurring theme that's come up a few times, and that is that Congress is in a weakened state. It's not fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities. It seems to be abdicating some of its responsibilities. And it strikes me that just weakens the opportunity for reform. If you don't have sort of a healthy political system, it seems to me like if we compare sort of now to the 1970s, when we talk, that's sort of the golden era for presidential reform, or reform of the executive branch more broadly. Am I right that a weakened Congress just upsets the whole sort of balance of power, checks and balances, that it complicates the reform process or the prospects of reform even more? Jack, do you agree?
Sure, I do agree. On many levels, it does. First of all, it makes reform hard in the first instance. Second, because it's hard for Congress to do anything. Second, I mean, despite that, I do want to emphasize, I think there are serious opportunities for reform here, but there's no doubt that Congress's weakened state makes it harder. Second, to the extent the reforms require ongoing congressional involvement and oversight, that is a sometimes heroic assumption. We actually designed many of our reforms with that in mind, and a lot of them just require one-time fixes from Congress and not a lot of ongoing reform through reporting, through giving responsibilities to other entities and the like. But let me just make the broader point. You could go even broader and say at the foundation of the problems we have with presidential power and presidential accountability, or the fact that Congress is not doing its job in terms of oversight, in terms of new laws and the like. We said at the outset of the book that we could have written a book about congressional reform. That's an even harder problem and a bigger and different problem, which we didn't take on. But there's no doubt that problems in the presidency are related to problems in Congress at the broadest level.
Do you agree, Bob, with that take?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there are some very deeply rooted reasons that we can look to. One of them, obviously, is what is sometimes referred to as our having now a separation of parties and not of powers. And so the party doesn't think institutionally, the parties in the Congress don't think institutionally, they think politically, meaning that when it comes time to defend the prerogatives of the institution of the Congress, they're mainly concerned with, in effect, the sort of partisan shakeout as it affects each of the parties. And if a party in Congress has a allied president in the White House, it strongly affects, how they're willing to think about, quote unquote reform outside of, and it's hard for them to think about it outside of a political frame. That's why, for example, we were saying earlier or alluding earlier to the possibility that with Trump out of the White House, you could have a discussion about some of these more achievable reforms like financial conflict of interest reform, because as long as it was an argument about whether Trump was doing bad things or not doing bad things, then it was very difficult to get the Republicans to participate in the debate, because they would view the reform proposal as simply another vehicle for attacking Donald Trump on the part of Democrats. But that is the fundamental problem, is the dissipation of an institutional focus.
Right. And sort of more broadly on the topic of dysfunction, our listener Fran is wondering about what you think about the status of the impeachment process. Do you think it is effective? Do you think it's not working? Do you have any comments on that?
Jack,
We've had two impeachment processes where it's been, partisan splits, the House doing one thing, the Senate doing another. What do you think?
Bob has more developed views on this than I do. I'll just make a simple point, and that is the impeachment process works if Congress is acting in an institutional and public interest and not in a party interest. And the problem Bob identified of the United States living under separation of parties, not powers, and the supermajority requirement in the Senate for conviction makes it very uncertain as a tool of accountability. It's a hugely important tool of accountability. It could have been used a lot more and should have been used more effectively during the Trump years. And it didn't, precisely because of this party tightness point. And I'm interested in what Bob thinks about this. I think that the experience with the Trump years renders the impeachment tool even weaker, an even weaker constraint on presidential power. If anything, in the end, Trump claimed victory both times. So I think the impeachment power comes out of the Trump administration in worse shape than when it went in. Bob, what do you think?
I agree with that. I mean, look, in a perfect world where all of a sudden we could all do the right thing, or at least go on something of a reforming binge, which we're not going to do, there are steps that Congress could take to strengthen the clarity, to add to the clarity and the effectiveness of the very rules that it's enacted to constrain itself or to direct itself or guide itself in the impeachment process. These arguments that you heard during the impeachment process about when witnesses would be called and whether witnesses would be called, and there are a whole host of questions that get presented that simply require renewed attention. Congress does have, the Senate, for example, has internal rules that guide the impeachment process, and they haven't been significantly looked at or revised in light of experience, in light of the number of presidential impeachments we've had just in the last several decades. It hasn't been looked at all. And I think that is problematic. I think there should be, again, this goes to institutional focus. Once there's not a president, if you will, in the dock or on his or her way there, that's the time for Congress in an institutional sense to say, what do we need to do to guide future Congresses better, and what constitutes a credible process for collecting the facts and applying constitutional standards to those facts to decide an impeachment. There's no appetite for that happening that I can see, and I don't think it is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the lack of appetite simply stems from the idea that so many of these members of Congress are simply like re-election focused? There's collective action problems. There's no one that really cares about the institution. They're all more focused on their personal political well-being. And so why bother spending a lot of your time and effort trying to come up with meaningful reforms and to get them passed when you might be better off either sort of making some public condemnation of the other party or bringing home a bridge? You have any comments on that?
Simply, really briefly, there are some members of Congress who do have institutional focus. There are Republicans and Democrats alike who are thinking right now about war powers reform and trying to take advantage of the openness of President Biden to that conversation. So I don't want to say across the board, they're all self-interested political machines, but there are tremendous pressures on them in setting priorities and deciding what their constituents care about, in weighing the choices they make against their reelection prospects, that do make long-term reform debates, particularly ones with any likelihood of generating controversy, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Jack, what about you? Thoughts on that?
I tend to agree with you, Katie. I think that there's, especially members in the House, but also in the Senate, they're obsessed with re-election. And as Bob was suggesting, any vote that's controversial and unnecessary that has uncertain political consequences for the reelection is the vote they want to avoid. That's why it's actually remarkable that we're seeing as much discussion in Congress about war powers, because that's traditionally one where Congress just, and this is a 1970s reform that failed, by the way, the war powers resolution. And that's one that Congress has definitely taken a hands-off approach towards for many, many decades now. So it's something somewhat unusual and surprising. We'll see when, if anything actually happens, that we do see movement on both sides of the political aisle towards rethinking congressional power in the war power space.
Our listener, Beth, wonders about the prospect of some sort of blue ribbon commission or some sort of mandatory review of the presidency every 10 years that would kind of review the status of the presidency and its functioning or lack thereof, and implement or fix things where they're broken. Is that a possible prospect to have some sort of mandatory reform efforts or mandatory blue ribbon commission?
So my view about that is A, that's what the Miller Center does. And B, that's what Congress is supposed to do. It's not clear. I think bipartisan, I don't know. I'm not sure what would be achieved by that. We definitely, if it would force debate on the presidency and if it focused public attention on it, I would be all for it. I'm not sure that it would.
What about you, Bob?
Yeah, I agree with Jack about the Miller Center, and I agree about the Congress's own role. Look, there's no harm in setting up periodic studies of how these institutions work. I would certainly put Congress on that list as well. But how it's structured and the timing of its efforts and so forth are going to have a lot to do with whether or not it would have any impact. And I tend to share Jack's skepticism, but I'd have to know more of the details.
Right. Okay, so it's sort of, we're getting close to the end of our hour. So two things. One is I was wondering if you could offer just your closing comments about the book, going forward after the book. And then Jack, there's a special question for you. Mary Kate wants to know why you wrote a book about Jimmy Hoffa. So Bob, why don't we start with you about closing comments, and then we'll move to Jack and we'll hear the side of the story of Jimmy Hoffa.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to talk about these issues. So thank you very much. And thank you for the excellent questions, and the audience for the excellent questions. I thought this was certainly one of the high points of my career, having the opportunity to write this book with Jack. And as he said at the very outset, not knowing what we could agree on and finding out that there was a lot that we could agree on and that we could lay out. And we've been very gratified by the reception. So we think there's room for this debate. I think our experience suggests that there is a debate to be had. We just hope it actually takes place in earnest and bears fruit. But thank you very much for having us.
Sure.
And I'll just say that it's just very important. Now is the time to do this, not when these issues get raised again. It's vital to understand that. It's hard to make happen, but now is the time to do it. As for Jimmy Hoffa, I wrote a book about Jimmy Hoffa because when I was 12 years old, my mother married a man who 6 weeks later turned out to be the leading suspect in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. He was my stepfather, and I grew up in the Hoffa disappearance maelstrom. And so it was kind of a memoir about my relationship with my stepfather and his role in the Hoffa disappearance.
Fascinating. Well, thank you both. It's been just a terrific opportunity for me to get to ask you about your book. And I encourage the audience to buy After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. It's an outstanding book by two outstanding scholars and public servants. So thank you for your service, and thank you for writing this terrific book. And thanks to the audience for listening. Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good day. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.